you everyone for joining us on our third episode of The Singing Brain. I am so excited for you all to meet our guest. Her name is Psyche Loui, and she is a psychology and neuroscience researcher. She's also an assistant professor at Northeastern University and the director of the Music, Imaging, and Neural Dynamics Lab, which is also known as the Mind Lab. Her lab focuses on understanding how our brains process music, and in addition to teaching and researching, Psyche is also a musician. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, Psyche, could you tell us, why you became interested in neuroscience and music?
Well, I've always been interested in science and the possibility that science could help people in a massive scale. And I've also been, as you mentioned, a musician pretty much all my life. I started playing the piano when I was 4. I started taking lessons when I was 5. And then I also started taking violin lessons when I was 7. And I still play, when in non-COVID times, I play in orchestra and chamber music and so on. And so at some point I realized, and I think this was during undergrad, when I was maybe a junior, I started taking more and more courses in neuroscience and kind of learning more and more about the brain and the mind and being really fascinated by that. And also I started realizing that there is an emergent field of music and the brain. And I think that the paper that really got me excited was, I think it was in 2000, the author named Stefan Kolsch, who had written a paper called Non-Musicians Are Musical, Brain Indices of Music Processing, something like that. And they were looking at brain responses to musical chords within chord progressions and how, and recording those responses using event-related brain potentials, which are brain waves that you can record on the surface of the scalp. And so when I was learning about event-related potentials in my neuroscience classes, and I was learning about these chords and chord progressions and their functions in my music theory classes, and it was just like my worlds collided, and that was when I realized that there's this small but really quickly growing literature that I could become part of. So I went to graduate school in psychology, but my main advisor was in the music department. His name was David Wessel, and he really opened my mind up to a lot of the exciting music cognition and perception work that was ongoing. And then I was fortunate to be jointly advised by a neuroscience professor and a psychology professor and a linguistics or psycholinguistics professor, and ended up kind of getting a motley educational experience from these different or overlapping disciplines. And wow. Then, yeah, I think that's kind of how I got started.
Wow, and that's really cool that you had, a background in music from such a young age, and you were really able to intertwine your interest with science. So that's really great.
It's a lot of fun, and I think that we still do all of those things. We still play music in my lab, when we can gather, yeah. And we still use those experiences to think about the brain, and I think there's something unique about music and the brain, being that music is such a subjective experience.
Sure.
But most people think of the brain and research in the brain as a very objective science. So there's something about using an objective tool to think about a subjective experience that's very appealing to me.
Interesting. What are some of the ways that you think that, music and emotions are intertwined?
Well, I think at the first level, definitely the sound, right? So I think the acoustic stimuli drive the emotions to some extent, but not, they're certainly not the full story. And I think that there's also a lot to do with your experience. I mean, it comes down to the nature and the nurture, and it's always both. But I think that the experiences that we can gain from even just short exposures, limited exposures to to short snippets of sounds can really quite dramatically change how you view or you think of an experience, or you experience that the emotion, as it's unfolding. And I think there's something about music because it has to unfold over time, right? And I think that emotions also unfold over time, right? It's part of this experience that it's you can feel certain emotions, but it's not like you're in the same state, during the whole musical piece. So I think of it as a sort of journey, music as a kind of journey through this space of different affective states, I guess.
That's really interesting. That's a great way to think about it. And, in previous interviews, we've talked about how music can be really beneficial for our brains. Can you explain what what music therapy is, and, what kinds of people it can be useful for?
Music therapy is an evidence-based practice that is administered by certified professionals to people, where music is used specifically to target certain states and to improve the human condition in usually special populations. And so my lab collaborates with some certified music therapists, mostly from the Berklee College of Music. There's quite a large program there. We're working with music therapists to help older adults relieve some stress, and also reduce their sense of loneliness, especially in times of COVID, using an 8-week music listening program. Right. So there's many different forms of music therapists. Some focus more on young children. Some focus specifically on children with certain disorders, such as autism spectrum disorder. The ones that we're working with right now are more specialized in working with older adults, especially older adults who may be experiencing mild cognitive impairment or even full-on Alzheimer's disease. So I think that's just a small subset of the music therapy world. We also have done some work where we're looking at neurological music therapy for folks with Parkinson's disorders. And so dance, for example, or rhythmic auditory stimulation is kind of a stripped down form of using movement and rhythm in music to engage some of those underlying networks that are disrupted in Parkinson's disease.
Wow.
So I think those are a few kind of a few forms of therapy where it does take a licensed professional who's gone through many hours of certification. But at the same time, I think people also kind of informally use music for therapy all the time. I think that a music therapy department wouldn't call that music therapy per se. Right. But you can use music therapeutically, and I think that most music therapists wouldn't disagree with the therapeutic power of music. But that can be much more general.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's so fascinating that you were talking about dance and using that as a form of therapy as well. I had never thought about that, but that's great, and especially in regards to Parkinson's, that's really cool. So my next question is about attention span in music. I think a lot of people, and kids in particular, struggle with ADHD, ADD, and I'm wondering if music can impact our attention span and specifically help it in any way.
Yeah, definitely. Music can. So in I think it was early 90s, yeah, so I think it was 1993, when a paper came out in the journal Nature about music for improving spatial skills. Right. So this was the famous Mozart effect, which turned out to not really replicate, or at least not really be there's not really something special about Mozart that helps your cognitive skills. But what they're finding initially was that when children were listening to Mozart, specific piece of Mozart sonata, they did better in math tests or in spatial tests afterwards, or spatial IQ tests afterwards. And I think that there's a more like a sociological point there to be made. I mean, it turns out that if you're listening to music that makes you happy, then you become more happy. And then happier people do better in all sorts of tests, including IQ tests. And so, I mean, so that's really explained by this general arousal, effective arousal that music can have. So it's not so much about Mozart per se. And so the media kind of misinterpreted that big time. But then I think, to answer the question of whether music can help attention, I think there's a lot of work that's still to be done, especially the sort of past decade. We've learned a lot about how the brain operates over time, in that there are these rhythms that are kind of recordable from populations of neurons that are on the surface of your that can be recordable from the surface of your scalp, right? So using event-related potentials and so on. And what we see from those recordings is that the brain behaves in very regular rhythmic ways. And so if there are ways in which the brain behaves regularly, and we also know that music has this rhythmic regularity, and that's why there's a beat, that's why there's a rhythm and there's a meter, can't we actually use music as a form of brain stimulation to co-opt those brain networks that help with cognitive abilities like attention? And so that's one of the collaborations that I'm working on right now. I'm working with a startup company called Brain.fm, and they actually make music for the brain. Like that's what they do. So the CEO likes to say that they want to be Netflix for the brain. Like if you want to focus, you turn on the focus channel. If you want to sleep, you turn on the channel for sleep. Right? If you want to relax, you turn on the channel for relax. And what Brain FM is trying to do is understand those different kinds of states of the brain, and then use music to kind of cater to those. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but from our testing, it does look like at least the people who need it the most, right? People with, for example, people with some borderline symptoms of ADHD, right? Mm-hmm. They do tend to do better when they're listening to that music compared to music that let's say Spotify or some other music makers produce without kind of knowledge of what the music or how the music targets the brain.
Right. Interesting. And that's really cool that, Brain.fm is sort of creating stations for every mood that you could possibly be in, and music for that. I mean, that's just like a highly intelligent radio, I think. So that's really cool. Yeah. That's great. And, my last question is more about what you've personally enjoyed about all of the, tons and tons of research that you've done. So what aspect or aspects have you, particularly been excited about in the research that you've done in the past or currently?
Well, right now I'm pretty excited about this possibility of using music as a form of brain stimulation. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think most people don't think of music composition as a science. Right. And then most people don't think of brain science as an art, right? Or really as a kind of therapeutic practice even. Yeah. Right. But I think that with the right kind of maybe multidisciplinary knowledge and application, I think it's possible to design music in a way that caters to how the brain works. And if we can do that, given how much we're learning about the brain at a very fast rate, I think we really can make music that's especially designed for, to help people with certain disorders, or also just to do a little bit better, like for everyday folks like you and me, sure. Maybe trying to study or trying to write, right? So can there be music for those situations? And also for folks who are Parkinson's or mild cognitive impairment, or can we actually design some music that's especially for what they need?
Interesting. I mean, that is very exciting. And, you touched on something that I've always found really interesting, which is that how artistic science can be and how scientific art can be. And so I think that's why the intersection between neuroscience and music is so fascinating, and also can be really beneficial to a lot of people. So thank you for sharing all of the incredible work and research that you've done. It is incredibly appreciated by me, and I'm sure all the viewers.
Great. Well, thank you for having me.